Now, the reason we are all here, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our panel, Emily Abbott, Savannah Hansen, and Maya Bose. Emily Abbott has a decade of experience driving social change and promoting health and well-being through intergenerational approaches. As co-founder of Intergenerational England, she has led initiatives to bridge generational divides, including the launch of the Intergenerational Housing Task Force, Intergenerational Workforce Development Task Force, building partnerships across the housing, care, health, and education sectors. Savannah Hansen is a passionate advocate for intergenerational collaboration and inclusive leadership. At Connect Futures, she is spearheading the establishment of the organization's first youth advisory board, ensuring young people shape decision-making. She also trains practitioners and senior leaders on engaging youth, equipping them with the tools to engage meaningfully with young people on topics such as online misinformation, radicalization, and socio-political complexity. Maya Bose developed her brand and marketing skills in TV, broadcast, and tech over 25 years. Before switching to the voluntary sector, she's a champion of the fresh perspective and skills that older employees bring to an organization. She's the founder of The Well Placed, a not-for-profit startup focused on helping people in midlife continue their careers into the voluntary sector. So thank you very much to our panel for providing your time and expertise today. We really appreciate it. So let's get started. Emily, I wonder if you could kick us off with an introduction to intergenerational workforces and why it is a topic of discussion now more than ever.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you to the team for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's a really timely conversation. Whether you know or not, we are a rapidly aging population. So, and this is a global trend. We're seeing it across the UK, but also further afield. But the UK is one of the most age-segregated countries in the world. And because of these demographic changes, we are now seeing 5 generations in the workplace. And this varies from sector to sector, but generally there is a higher influx of generational disparity within that workforce. And yet only 6% of employees really know how to harness age diverse workforces. So there's definitely something that we need to start thinking about and figuring solutions for. Just to provide a little bit of context of who I am and what our approach to this intergenerational world is. So we're a not-for-profit organisation and we're really dedicated to advancing intergenerational practice through advocacy, research and systematic change. And we champion this approach from human connection right through to system change, involving cross sectors to really embed this intergenerational way of working, commissioning, building, right back at the core of how we develop society and how we build social change. And from our perspective, the intergenerational approach is very expansive and all-encompassing. We look at it in a variety of ways. So really trying to harness the intergenerational social support system. So within a workplace, how do you build connection at a human level across generations, really recognizing the nuances of experience and identity, but building connections that can help support health and well-being, build resilient communities, whether that's in a social context or within a workplace context. We take a real life course approach. So I think often when you think of the word intergenerational, you might think of the two polarizing ends of the spectrum, but for us, it's really looking at that life course. So at any stage of life, recognizing that you're part of this intergenerational way of working and way of being. We recognize the intersectional perspective, so that age is definitely a component, but realizing people are much more than that. So that intersection between age and gender and race and socioeconomic background, to really understand, again, the experience and expectation that people have and how do we harness that as people age and those priorities might shift and evolve. For us, the intergenerational model is also about intergenerational partnerships. So again, looking at people as a whole person, we do a huge amount of work around creating pathways between businesses and wider community. Again, recognizing that someone is not just where they work, but also where they live and their social connection and their transportation abilities and you know, all of those pieces of the puzzle are really important. And for that, we really try to do it at both a kind of grassroots and system social level. And at the heart of it for us, that we do believe that there's a cultural shift that needs to happen. You know, that we're hearing a lot of rhetoric in the media and in politics around, you know, Gen Zs are hoarding the wealth and they store the houses, and sorry, the baby boomers and the Gen Zs are lazy and power hungry, and there's a huge language and rhetoric that's we're kind of being fed that I think is exacerbating these differences and creating friction at all levels. We really need to start challenging businesses and holding businesses accountable to really promoting spaces where intergenerational dialogue can take place, and we can start to address some of these biases. Um, I think it's really important very quickly to recognize that this is not a new concept, it's not a new way of living. This intergenerational model of practice has been embedded and is embedded within cultures globally and also within our own country. But we've lost that value and intention behind why these relationships are so important. For us, it's really relevant today, I think, in this conversation to replace the intentionality behind it, recognizing that we are multi-generational, workplace and multi-generational communities are, but what steps do we need to take to become truly intergenerational, to build relationships, to foster that dialogue, and to create environments where this type of diversity can be a driver of success. Which I'm sure we can talk more about of how that looks practically, but in a nutshell, that's kind of our angle to this conversation.
Thanks, Emily. I think what you were saying there about life course really brings us nicely to Maya. At Well Placed, you help individuals transition into roles in the charity sector. Could you explain what concerns and opportunities arise for these individuals when they make this career change?
Yeah, sure. Hello to everyone who's joined us today, and thank you to Claude for the invitation to join the panel as well. So as you've just mentioned, Steve, the Well Placed helps people who already have 20 or more years work experience switch from the corporate commercial sector into the charity sector. And what we do is work with charities to create 6-month paid placements. And in most of the cases, the majority of the cases, the individual in the placement and their line manager are from different generations. You asked about opportunities and concerns. Well, the opportunity that's most valued I refer to them as associates. The opportunity that's most valued by the associates, who so far have all been women, although this initiative is open to men as well, it's to be able to continue to use their experience and their skills, but in a new setting. Many of them are coming back into the paid workplace, and this initiative gives them the opportunity to extend their careers, but extend their careers into work that's mission driven. And when it comes to their concerns, it's actually pretty ironic, given that our discussion today is around intergenerational workforces, because their concern was my focus when I was talking to charities on co-generational working. And I learned very quickly that I was focusing too much on the age difference between the associate and the line manager. And actually, the magic of that partnership comes from diversity of experience. Because if you've worked for 10 years or if you've worked for 30 years, you're just going to have a different perspective. And I think that should be the focus rather than the age. And actually, one of the associates quite early on said to me, "Do you know, Maya, I never used to think about my age, but I've started to think about my age because you keep using the word co-generational." So I just stopped saying it. And instead, I replaced diversity that comes from age with diversity that comes from experience. These are simply colleagues who are working together who have a different experience. So maybe intergenerational isn't the best word to use. I know it's an easy shorthand, but it is loaded with assumptions and stereotypes that diverse experience doesn't have.
Interesting. Thanks, Maya. I think that's definitely something we can explore, challenging that kind of terminology a bit later on. Thank you. Savannah, as someone who works closely with young people, I wonder if you could provide a snapshot of the experiences of Gen Z as they enter the workforce.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you also for the invite. I'm delighted to be here. I guess I should start with defining who on earth generation. Did you say Generation Z or Generation Z? Because I noticed I naturally say Generation Z, and I'll explain why in a second. But I'm talking about people born between 1997 and 2012. Depends on, the source that you're looking at. But in 2025, that means the eldest are around 28 years old and the youngest being 13. and that makes me on the older end, but I did make it in the Gen Z group. And I make that reference because I know someone called out my saying Gen Z over Z being British. And that's because I think the vast majority of us have been raised with social media, right? Sorry. And so we have, naturally quite a globalized, Americanized take on, how we communicate. It's very different to perhaps the generation above us that were, getting a phone maybe in the later teen years, 20s, but we actually were raised on social media platforms, and the online world has played a huge role in our identities and how we create community. And on those platforms, there's also, of course, how we witness the world, a lot of information overload, and we've seen significant societal upheaval, unrest. I think every generation has had their thing that's, defined their generation and or shocked people. But for us, I'm specifically talking about, for example, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter movement. And so a lot of discussions around race. We've got more recently Israel-Palestine, so a lot around international conflict. And so a lot more discussion around, and even, I guess, comfortability to talk about injustice and inequality. Mind you, a lot of this happened during a pandemic, which again is something that happened, everyone experienced, but especially for those in Generation Z. I remember in 2021, I was running for an elected student position, and I took this whole approach of us taking back control of our futures because I, like many people, really felt like we were missing out on genuine opportunities that would have shaped our futures, our careers. I, for example, didn't get to study abroad, and I could joke about it at the time, but it was quite devastating because it's definitely something that I thought would, shape what kind of things I'd want to do in the future. And, you find yourself sitting in your room in your pajamas doing a civil service internship, and it's just very different to what you expect. And so a lot of people related to that. And I think that's why that campaign was successful. And there's a lot of other things like, we can talk about social justice, etc., and people being more aware, but there's also things like the climate crisis that, it's not just um, it's very real in that there's this question around what, not just what does the future look like, but the future is not guaranteed is a very real question that people, conversation that people are having. And I think, saying all this, it's no surprise then that young Britons report higher levels of unhappiness than older generations. Only about 60% of 13 to 27-year-olds claim that they feel in control of major aspects of their lives. And, I do think that's probably the reason why a lot more Generation Z um, people saying that they're more likely to report, worse mental health and so on. So, that's the context in which we're coming into work. And I think everyone can relate to different parts of that, of course, but I think that then shapes how we enter the workplace where, from an angle of uncertainty and unpredictability, there's something in that where you ask yourself then, if I can't guarantee what tomorrow will look like or what the future will look like, at least let everything I do, at least let the work that I do have some kind of purpose. Does it align with my values? Does it bring meaning to me every single day? And I can see elements of that in what Maya's saying actually about, maybe, people feeling that later on in life at a point. But I think for a lot of people in generations, that's where we're kind of starting with. And so, not wanting to separate your home mask from your work mask, things like that, this bringing these things together. And yeah, not just wanting to do something about the things happening in the world, but expecting the organization you're at to also be willing to do things about, what's happening globally, especially if they have like the power to do so. And if they don't do it, then a lot of Generation Zers are doing it themselves. And so you see side hustles, a lot of people with multiple streams of income, and a lot of people, it's being a social media influencer, e-commerce, etc., etc. There's a lot going on where, people are not just really relying on a single income. And I think that's a part of that's because of ambition, but also because of cost of living crisis, not being able to hit different milestones because one wage is not really allowing us to do that in the same way as before. So I do think there's a lot going on. And my last point here is simply that when all of this is happening, you've got multiple jobs. I have a stat on that. I think it's 45% of Gen Zers actually that have a side hustle. But when that's all happening, there's something here now about mental health, what is work doing around EDI, transparency, flexibility, and so on. And so, there's a risk of burnout, and trying to find that work-life balance and being more open about it is something that I think definitely defines this generation. We're definitely not a monolith. Please check out, if you haven't already, Channel 4's Trends, Truth and Trust report, which you can, see different perspectives of what's, different groups within Generation Z. But yeah, I think that's pretty much the context that this generation is coming from and how it's shaping how we show up.
Savannah, thanks for that insight. We're now going to switch over to some questions for all three of you. They're going to be around leadership and intergenerational workforces in practice. So feel free to come in, all three of you. So the first question is, what opportunities for integration should leaders be looking for in their teams and organizations, and what pitfalls should they avoid?
Shall I come in initially?
Thanks.
Great. No, I just thought it was just really interesting listening to Maya and Savannah there as well, because I think, pulling on two different cohorts or demographic groups, but actually very much some shared themes and ideas and experiences. And I think that's one of the main things, we do a lot around, in corporate businesses with leaders. And there's that real balance around recognizing that generational trends and experiences do have an impact on people's expectation of the workforce, their ability to connect in certain ways, their desire to, what their life want, what they want their life to look like, but also not falling into the stereotypes that we have. We do a lot around, understanding that there isn't a one size fits all, and really, recognizing what your generational profile looks like, and how that balance between, the formative social experiences that each generation have. So, for example, you've got the post-industrial revolution, and then the 2008 crash, and then COVID, and now the rise of AI. But those experiences, when people enter the workforce and similarly when they leave, are really pivotal to shaping how the language and the communication and the expectation of the workforce is shaped for an individual. And I think that, alongside also people's personal experiences, so for example, for women, whether that's having children or going through menopause, and how those two really sit next to each other. I think we can't separate the fact that age does play a role in this, but being really convicted in the fact that it shouldn't shape how we look at different people and look at different groups. And I think, from a personal perspective, I'm also at the end of the Gen Z cohort bracket. And I think it comes with a lot of, again, stereotypes and preconceptions. And when you sit in rooms with people, there's a real internal ageism that you bring to the table, around that miscommunication or frustration that definitely is socially embedded within who we are. And Savannah made some really good points there about, the fact that we as a generation, want meaningful experiences, and we want to feel passionate about what we're doing. But I don't think that is, isolated in just our generation. I think that is a feeling and experience that people have across all aspects of life. I always use the example that Gen Zs are fighting for this 4-day working week. We want flexibility. Ask anyone who doesn't want a 4-day work week and to be paid the same amount of money. I don't think it, I think it's when we kind of hone it into a specific generation, that's where the problem starts to develop. So there's a whole thing around not being blind to the age, being aware of the age, but not letting it define who we are. And I think from a leadership perspective, recognizing that you're also part of that journey and part of that infrastructure of generational connection, and you have the ability to create these pathways and this empathy and understanding across your workforce, by creating, whether it's, spaces where people can challenge the stereotypes or express their feelings or share experiences and find those common grounds, creating that psychological safety within the workplace so people, feel able to share what they need and what they want out of the workforce. And there's huge statistics and also gaps in our understanding, but there is a foundation around how this can support in retention of staff, how this can support in your recruitment efforts, how this actually has an economic growth angle to it. When you look at age diversity and you harness it in that way, we can actually develop a really strong and successful workplace.
I think I agree with everything you just said, Emily, and I think there's been a huge societal shift over the past 50 or more years away from generations mixing on a daily basis. It used to be in your neighborhood because people were born, lived and died in the same neighborhoods, or generations mixed at church. And now the workplace is where that's happening. I know you said at the beginning there are 5 generations in the workplace, which I just find impossible to get my head around. But it's almost like we have to learn how to converse with people from different generations. Like we have to learn. You said in your opening remarks, Emily, I wrote it down, about how we've lost the value behind why these generational connections are important. And Savannah, what you were saying, I found it really interesting about how, the younger generation, Generation Z, entering the workforce with a degree of uncertainty and not wanting to separate the home mask from the work mask. That's very different to when when my generation entered the workforce, there was no uncertainty. I mean, we had other issues like nuclear disarmament and the miners' strike, but we got a free education, we could buy houses. And I just think that within workforces, in terms of integration, there is a need to create mixed experience teams. And by mixed experience, it does mean, if you're talking about longevity of experience, you're going to have different generations in there, and just people learning to speak together. I mean, I read in a newspaper a couple of months ago that there was a younger colleague avoided going into the kitchen when there was someone older in there because they didn't know what they were going to say to them.
Yeah,
and I just think that unless we sit down and we communicate with each other, how are we going to learn all these things about each other's lives? Because again, going back to when I started work, you were very much, it was your work mode. You would make friends and you'd share your private life with them, but by and large, you didn't. And also, I don't remember segmenting or categorizing people into generations. They were just people you worked with. So I think we need to talk to each other. I've already learned so much from the two of you just in the last, 20 minutes. And I think now that has to happen in the workplace.
I agree. I think talking to each other is probably that's pretty much where my passion for intergenerational work and interaction, where that came from, having much older colleagues than me who were really my best friends at work, and being able to just experience that without putting a label on what generation we're from, things like that. But that story that you just kind of said, Maya, kind of made me think of how it's really important that we do have these, inter-experienced, situation spaces that we learn from each other kind of together in this horizontal way, I think is important. But also there is still a power dynamic that should probably be acknowledged. And I think if we don't do that, then it does feel lack that authenticity that I was trying to speak to earlier. And so I think there's definitely, a lot more work to be done in figuring that out. And I don't know if it means the kind of the systemic work I'm trying to do of getting young people to be involved in every level at an organization. And that might look very different because, again, experience is important, but figuring out how do you make sure there's that voice everywhere? Because if we're honest, there is older people than Gen Z, at least what I'm talking about, do dominate leadership positions. Like that just is how it is. And so then it's how do we make sure that there's that, interaction throughout.
It's interesting because in the placements, we mostly have someone who's line managing who's 30, and they're line managing probably for the first time someone who's 50.
Yeah.
So it's the dynamic is completely changed around.
Yeah.
But what comes out of that is this appreciation that neither has better experience, they just have different experience. Because the associates have loads of experience of the workplace, but they know nothing about the charity sector, which is what their line manager knows about. So it's like a knowledge swap.
That makes
I think,
sense.
I think what you're saying there about the line manager and your associates kind of working together, Maya, leads us nicely to the next question around leadership styles. So what leadership styles work best to foster collaboration across intergenerational workforces?
You go.
Okay, all right, thank you. I just had an example of something that I did a project. So I was working in Cardiff on a leadership program, but I was leading a group of 16 to 17-year-old sixth form girls, and we did a task where we spoke about, what actually makes a good leader, or what do you think a good leader is, and or what kind of leader would you like to be? And they made these really big posters and drew leaders and labeled all these different characteristics, and things like being hardworking and reliable, intelligent came out. But a lot more present were words like being kind, thoughtful, someone who cares about the environment, and being a good listener, being creative. And, there is some discussion about, okay, it was maybe there's something about gender and the fact that I was working with a group of girls specifically, like all of the leaders that they drew were women. But also, I think there's something about how we view leadership being a lot more collaborative, a lot more empowering, somebody that isn't just, this authority figure, but someone that you can work with, and, you respect their expertise. It's something to aspire towards, but it's not the relationship doesn't feel as distant as maybe we traditionally see things like that. And so I think there is an element of, building trust and genuinely asking everyone for their input as well. So it's a more collaborative approach is what I was picking up.
I saw someone put the word compassionate into the chat, which I agree with. I'd say be curious. What do you really know about the individuals in your team? What have they done in past jobs in different organizations? What are they really good at? I've joined companies and started to lead new teams where I've discovered that there are skills that are being completely underutilized or not utilized at all. So in term for the organization, that's not great for productivity, but on a human level for the employee, it's even worse because they're just not getting the job satisfaction that they could have, and they probably disengage at some point, maybe even leave. And the other thing I say is for leaders to check your ego, leave it at the door, because as a leader, your role is to value different perspectives and make space for them and give everyone that space to have their voice heard. So I'd say consider it a good day if someone's challenging your thinking.
Absolutely. I would agree with all of that. And I had very similar words, the curiosity piece. I think there's also, we talk a lot about a bit of an empathy gap. I think we sometimes lack that empathy piece when we think about people who maybe are experiencing different things or come from a different place. And specifically in the workforce, we spend a huge amount of our time in the workplace and with those individuals. And I think getting back to the humility of it all, that human nature that we have from a leadership perspective, leading with kindness and leading with empathy and compassion and understanding, and also thinking, realistically that people are much more than the workforce. So thinking beyond the workplace, where do they go after they leave, and what do they need to help facilitate, their journey while they're here. And I think that sometimes is missing when you balance it up with sort of, the economic drive and the productivity ratings. But actually, if you can create a culture that harnesses, well-being and connection and empowers people and creates this equity of voice across generations and across people, then ultimately results will be much better. So I think we've kind of lost the human, I think in a lot of cases, just getting back to how we want to be treated and creating environments that allow that to happen naturally.
And I think also recognizing that it does take confidence to speak up in group meetings, and I've been in some recently where the more junior members of the team weren't particularly vocal. So I think it's important for leaders to not just create the space for everyone to speak and be heard, but also to support people with the confidence to do that.
And I think just picking up that point, Maya, I think, sometimes it's not going to happen naturally. You're not going to be sat in a board meeting. It's just naturally people are going to feel confident and comfortable to do that. So as a leader, what steps do you need to take to get to that point? And there might be other approaches or activities or focus or whatever it might be. There's lots of examples of good practice in that area, but what are the steps that you need to take to get to the place where intergenerational dialogue and diversity is right at the heart of your workforce?
Thank you, everyone. And our kind of next question, you've definitely touched on already, Savannah, with kind of Gen Z. But are there significant differences in motivations behind job satisfaction and retention across generations?
I think it's a yes and no. So we've kind of discussed it where there's a basic human things that people value, as Emily was talking about. So people just want to feel valued, I think, for the work that they're doing, to feel like the work they do matters, and to be treated fairly, I think is like the basics. I do think that there is that Gen Z angle of, wanting to start your career and wanting to have a lifelong career that is values led. I think very clear development is important as well. But I mean, even as I'm saying this, I think just because we might put more at the forefront of, how we decide, at the beginning of our careers, I think everyone does value these things anyway. I think it does boil down to just this basic human need to be seen, to be heard, and that probably comes with the communication and the kind of discussion that was just happening. Curiosity stood out to me because God, I think you really need curiosity when working across different generations, because it's so easy, and I see it so often where someone just doesn't quite understand why someone's done something. Like, why have you texted me instead of called me about this really important thing? And that face, like, of like, what is this? I don't understand this. It is really about asking questions, genuinely assuming the best in people, especially if you've employed them, trusting that they're doing something with good intention and trying to figure out, where they're coming from. And I think that happens across all generations, so requires that yeah, trying to communicate each other's needs and expectations.
Yeah, I totally agree. I do think, I mean, with fear of not to fall into the stereotypes, that there are communicational differences that we are seeing across generations, and specifically in the workforce. You say how people like to communicate, whether that's texting or AI or actually, written notes or emails. It's there's slightly different. I think I was reading an article the other day about, how people sign off their emails being quite different. And again, we can look at these very generational aspects of how people communicate. I think it is important to recognize that there are shifts in technology and there are shifts in how we experience the world around us, and that is going to come into the workplace a lot more. You see all the fun TikToks around the Gen Z language and advertising and PR, and those are all very common and things that are happening and we're seeing day to day. And I think there is a divide there in terms of how those experiences are being had across generations, and to not shy away from that, but actually how do you harness that and create that mutual learning of whether it's through technology or information. I also think there's a huge piece around language, and we do a lot of work around language and funny, yeah, TikTok, yeah, what is it? It's dangerous. So a lot of things around language and actually, how we want to be spoken to, how we might articulate how we're feeling. Savannah's talked a lot about it, the values alignment. There's a lot of knowledge around that. There's statistics around the fact that this generation, whether Gen Z, millennials, seem to be job hopping a lot more. They're moving from workplace to workplace, as opposed to previous generations, which they would get a job and they would be in the job for the majority of their working life. And a lot of that comes down to finding the right place where your values are aligning. And I think that's not necessarily a shift in priority. Well, yeah, it is a shift in priority, but it's not, you know, Savannah mentioned, it's not necessarily that other generations didn't prioritize that. It's just that the economic and work landscape was so different then. It's not as fluid as it is now, and it's not as you know, easy to have multiple hats and portfolio careers and all of these things and side hustles. You know, that wasn't something that structurally in society was happening. But it doesn't mean that there's a negative, and it doesn't mean that there's a, you know, a further segregation between these two worlds. It just means that we have to look at the bigger social context and bring that into what's happening in the workplace.
I mean, in terms of job satisfaction, I can only really talk to the generation or the midlife group that I work with, but the job satisfaction for them is being in mission-driven work and being given the opportunity to do something new. And I've got a terrible statistic that there are 1 million people in this country over the age of 50 who want to work and can't find a job that they want to do. You know, we live in a very ageist society, and there's a sharp drop in employment over the age of 55. So if you're older and you're in work, then job stability is really important.
The last question to conclude this section is really around, what does an effective intergenerational workforce look like to you all?
You go, Maya.
I've seen it work effectively across teams within an organization. I don't think I can point to an entire organization and seen it work well. Mutual respect, no one's opinion or experience is better than anyone else's, it's different. I mean, communication has come up in our responses to every single question. You know, we just need to connect and talk with each other more. And I think leadership that actively encourages knowledge exchange, you know, and it might not be something that comes naturally. So I think coaching should be available to help. I mean, I work with non-profits. I just work with charities, and they often have a culture of collaboration because they have a mission-driven purpose. And that's what unites employees rather than thinking about intergenerational working.
I think mutual learning, kind of what you said, and not feeling like we're training each other as such, but learning together. But also I want to make a proposal. I think an effective intergenerational workforce is disc tested. And if anyone doesn't know what I'm talking about DISC, the kind of personality working style test, because in one of the posters actually about this event, advertising it, there's a question of whether is this a generational thing or a personality thing. And I think sometimes we don't talk about that enough, that people really do just have different personalities coming from completely different experiences, backgrounds. And so simply understanding people's communication styles and, you know, how they like to be valued, etc., I think has definitely helped me, you know, figure out how to just simply communicate with people better, that I might have assumed just off the bat based on bias that, oh, it's a generational thing, when actually it's not that at all. And you know, it's not, this sounds really terrible if you're not familiar with the book, but there's a book called Surrounded by Idiots as well, which is pretty much trying to summarize all of the DISC personalities as well. And this isn't me saying to put people in boxes again, because I guess that's the overarching thing of this conversation. We're trying to do the opposite of that, but to at least use different tools to try and understand people a little bit better, and again figure out that not everyone's an idiot. You're not an idiot either. You're just coming from different perspectives, and that's okay. Just to be more intentional. I think that's the word I want to say, intentional. It's all good putting a thing with the youth board, for example. It's all good there just being one that I'm setting up, but I had to be very, very clear that it needs to be youth-led. It needs to be asset-based. So, May, I don't think you use that word specifically, but this idea that it's the strengths the team already has and not this deficit thinking, like what do we have and how can we be more asset-based in our approach. But it doesn't work if not everyone's aware of the values that I'm trying to push forward for this specific policy, let's say. So yeah, I think disc tested is one thing.
It's interesting. And just following on from that, I think you know, making sure that people recognize that they're all part of it. So it's not a responsibility of one person or one department within a workplace, but actually it's creating a culture within that workplace. So right at the top management to HR to the employees to whoever is working in that space has to understand the value of this way of working and be committed to advancing it in that way. There's some great work with Pfizer that have a generations exchange program that we've been working with them on, where they create these intentional spaces where they bring together people from different generations around a specific topic, which might be feminism or war. It's very kind of hard-hitting topics, but to create that mutual exchange and to build a culture where people can challenge and be challenged, that then filters out into the day-to-day workplace, and those relationships will continue. And you've created a safety and an experience that people can then take forward. But that is not to say that it's only the responsibility of the workforce. A lot of this sits with the power, and creating that power fluidity across teams, I think is really important to create progress here. And also really recognizing that we have to think about this now. We can't kind of shy away from it. These demographic changes are as inevitable as climate change. It's happening, and we don't have the tools yet within the workplace, within the social context, to be able to support it and build solutions that are empowering and collaborative. So we have to move forward in this way. Yeah.
Thanks, Emily. I think the biggest thing coming through for me at this point is just the importance of communication and chatting with each other, your teams and organizations. We're now going to move over to questions from all of you attending today. So thank you to everyone who provided questions before the session. And I've seen lots of people put in questions in the chat as well, so hopefully pick up on a few of those. We're going to dive into questions. So if you prefer to come off of mute and ask a question, please use the raise hand feature and we'll try and get to you. But we'll stick with the theme of communication at the moment. So if people are thinking about discussing this topic in their workplace, what tips do you have how they could go about bringing it up, particularly if they're nervous about maybe saying the wrong thing?
I think to follow on from what I was trying to talk about earlier is that if you propose to your team that the best way to function well as a team is to understand where everyone's coming from and what strengths they have, what values they bring to the table, I think that's something that it's a part of, again, helping people to feel that they're genuinely being seen, that the work that they do is valuable. Because again, when I've been in teams before and we have done this like personality testing and so on, it's so easy to then sometimes you'll get a little pie chart of where everyone sits, and it's so then easy to see the value everyone brings and where, if we didn't have this, then we wouldn't have that, and so on. And so really being able to really see what makes a team and how everyone brings their experiences and so on in a way that makes the team as productive as it is. But you can't do that if you're not aware of what people aren't comfortable to be fully themselves in that way.
I think coming from a slightly different angle, we've talked a lot about the communication and the empathy, which is so important, but obviously, recognizing there are agendas and egos everywhere you go in the workplace, and people have different priorities and ambitions. So if it's something that you've spotted, but actually the language and trying to get that across, there are some really shocking stats around whether it's, let me get them up here. The World Economic Forum suggested that investing in intergenerational age diverse workforces can raise GDP per capita by 19%. So that, there's an economic case to be made here. The London School of Economics said that 87% of employees in an age inclusive workplace report higher productivity compared to 48% in non-inclusive ones. So you've got some statistical evidence to kind of help drive forward this case for support, if it's something that you've spotted and you want to help move.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of research as well about how intergenerational teams problem solve in a much more innovative and creative way, which comes back to this because you view the world of work and life through a different lens depending how long you've lived in it.
Another question we've had through are, what incentives can we develop to encourage greater intergenerational collaboration? Or how can we help people see the value in this? We kind of already talked about the economic value. Are there any other kind of value points to this?
I just think I maybe it's a thing of I just really love learning from other people, but there's a lot to learn. It's quite enriching to speak to people from completely different. There's loads of different backgrounds that experiences people have, whether it's cross racial lines, class lines, etc. But the intergenerations, generational differences is just one of many different, I guess, filters through which people view the world, and it's I've just found it very enriching, I think, just on a personal level, just to be able to have genuine connection with people. And I hope is that sellable in of itself, just to connect again with humans and to feel seen across different generations.
We have a national campaign called Talking Generations, which I mean is relevant to this, but it's all about creating spaces where intergenerational dialogue, intersectional dialogue can take place, and people can share stories and experiences in a safe space and have that kind of positive feedback and build those relationships. And I think I've seen firsthand how you can center around a specific topic that's a specific social issue like racism or classism or whatever it might be, and that diversity of voice and experience can actually break down those barriers and start to build new ways of thinking and new perspectives. But it's really difficult, I think, for people to take steps towards that, no matter where you are, unless it's been, it happens in the right environment and that there is a psychological safety around it. I think it's really difficult to start taking those steps and to be open to being wrong or to being challenged or to shifting your perspective in that way. And I think that's an internal and an external thing. We've got a lot of internal bias within us that is often fed by what we read and what we see. And so challenging that on all levels, I think, is really important to taking the right steps.
Yeah. I mean, I work in the preventing misinformation, like spread of fake news and so on space, and it's very easy to forget. Again, this is I guess a generational difference, but how people get their information and so today, for example, but while before maybe you'd see a news story on the BBC, everyone sees the same story at the same time of day. Now everyone's getting completely different angles from their phones and the same thing that happened. And so it is very easy to speak past each other about the same thing because we're coming from much more different, and it's great that we have more perspectives and access to information sooner, but it does mean that we lose sight of how the different backgrounds people are coming from. So I think being quite transparent about that and how things have changed and being quite open to again learn from one another and not think we have all the answers, regardless of where we're coming from.
It's interesting because the conversation that we've been having, it's the sort of informal conversation that you have when you're in the office and you're getting your lunch out of the fridge. And I do worry that with more remote working, that isn't going to happen as often.
Yeah. Well, I think it's great for accessibility and flexibility. There's definitely a balance to be struck there in making sure we're not missing the lunchtime chat when you grabbing
Yeah,
your
well, you both refer to the human connection, and
yeah.
it's quite hard to get a human connection through a screen. I mean, you can, but it's just not the same.
Yeah.
It certainly seems like there needs to be a real effort to make these connections.
Yeah, maybe that's the thing. You just need to have the intention to make more of an effort if you're not physically in the same place.
We're nearly at time. Just a last any comments from either of you before we finish off? Any last pleas or advice or comments?
I just want to finish by I love ChatGPT, and I'm the sort of person who puts please at the end of my questions. And ChatGPT's response to my question of are you old? They just said, well, you know, it doesn't experience time or age in the way that humans do. And so it doesn't consider itself old or young, and its knowledge is based on whatever the latest data upload was. So it's basically saying, don't ask me my age, ask me what I know.
Wow.
You know, and I think we can learn from ChatGPT.
Amazing.
Yeah, don't ask. I was being forced into retirement because I couldn't find a job, which is why I set up the Well Place, because I just wanted to prove to the, you know, how many applications that I didn't get through that actually they'd missed something. So yeah, we should connect more on a human level and be curious and interested in the other person's life and their life experience and their knowledge.
I think, oh, sorry, Fanny, you go.
So I was just going to say, you can't really separate the two as much as we do say, oh, this is work, this is life. They do, we can't help that. They do and definitely influence each other. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to take it right back full circle back to Maya said at the start, you know, around the word intergenerational, which I think was really fascinating and something that we're working on at the minute around, you know, how people think about intergenerational, what it means to them, where they see themselves within that picture of intergenerational. And I think from my perspective, who, you know, lives, breathes this stuff, is the feels is where I think the power is this integration, interconnected, intergenerational. And it's not about, you know, where it differs to the cross sector or cross-generational it's about how we interact and how we come together and all of these kind of nuances of experiences, but the power of when we collaborate and bring those experiences together. So I would just, I mean, I put it out to everyone on this today, but what intergenerational means to you, and yeah, maybe take that forward and seek out where those intergenerational moments happen, because they're all around us. We just don't recognize it as much anymore.
Something to ponder over lunch or the rest of the day. Thank you. That takes us to the end of our session today. It is clear that this is a layered and crucial topic, and we hope the session has provided you with some inroads, how you could begin to contribute to discussions in your organization about making the most of intergenerational workplaces. A big thank you to Emily, Savannah, and Maya for your time today. We'll be sure to link the panel's organizations in our follow-up email, as well as the recording of today's session. So keep an eye on your inboxes over the coming days. As promised, I also wanted to just briefly mention some of our current programs that we're offering. We've recently been accredited by the Institute of Leadership, so all of our programs that I'm about to mention are accredited and come with post-nominals and other benefits for anyone who completes them. So for new managers in your organizations, we have our Management Fundamentals program, a 7-week online program which introduces you to an array of impactful practical management tools and concepts, which is delivered to you through online sessions with our professional facilitator, and some self-guided modules for you to explore as well, which include you as a manager, healthy communication, your productivity, running effective teams, and future thinking. We also have our Discover program, which really is our entry-level course into how we think about leadership here at Claw Social Leadership. It's a short 4-week course with 2 facilitated workshops. And lastly, we have our Emerging and Experienced Leader programs, both launching for recruitment in May. You can register your interest with both of those on our website now. That is it from us. Thank you once again for your time this afternoon, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.